Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Polycrisis in the Anthropocene. This follows on from a special collection guest edited by Mike Lawrence and Ortwin Wren, which we are publishing in Global Sustainability. The first papers of the collection have published, and we are planning a second webinar in September when the full set have. In a moment, I'll hand over to Mike Lawrence, who will introduce the collection. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have all joined in listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear us, but not able to speak to us. However, you will have the opportunity to submit chat questions by typing your questions into the Q&A of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If we are unable to get through all the questions during the session, they will be included in the follow-up email we will send after the webinar. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please add this to the questions box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event that we do experience any issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. So to summarize, you can submit your questions at any time, and you'll also receive a follow-up email at the end, which will give another opportunity to ask any questions that you have. And now I'll hand over to Mike Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Alison. I'm Michael Lawrence. I'm a guest section editor on the Polycrisis in the Anthropocene special issue and a research fellow at the Cascade Institute, a Canadian think tank that applies complex systems thinking to global challenges. Now, when we first issued the call for papers for this special issue more than a year ago, many were still dismissing the polycrisis concept as a buzzword, as a sort of passing fad. But since then, the term has only grown more and more popular, which signals, I think, a widespread concern that the world's many crises are interconnected in ways that challenge our ability to understand and to respond. So after a few key conferences, we had a very strong response to our call for papers by authors of very diverse backgrounds. 13 papers have now been published and are available through open access online, and we have about a dozen or so still on the way. And I think these contributions demonstrate that far from an empty buzzword, the polycrisis concept opens a very productive research program. It provides insights on the past, and it helps us to explore possibilities for the future. So I'm very happy to open this webinar with 5 special issue contributors whose foci range from the theoretical to the practical and to the political. So it's my pleasure to start off by introducing Pia Johanna Schweitzer, who leads the Systemic Risks Research Group at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam. So, Pia.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to you today. My take on this specific topic on polycrisis is an angle rooted in systemic risk. This is why I'll first introduce you to our take on systemic risk that we had with our paper co-authored by my colleague Silkka Juhola and I for this special issue. Next slide, please. Next slide. So together with Silkka, who's based at the University of Helsinki, we rose to the challenge of responding to this request to have more integrated governance approaches to tackle with systemic risk. And in our understanding, our definition of systemic risk, this is about the risk or the probability of breakdowns in an entire system which provides essential functions for society. So something on which humans really depend. And a key driver that we identified is the connectivity between systems that then cause ripple effects to affect systems far beyond the domain in which the risk event originally manifested. So there are cascading effects on systems that threaten basic functionality on which society depends. And this is our angle, sort of we approach this discussion on systemic risk and polycrises from a policymaking and governance perspective. We are both social scientists. This might be important information so that you understand where our approach comes from. This is why we also identified and went through a whole list of literature on governance that identifies several challenges for systemic risk governance. Our starting point was that in previous research, a couple of key characteristics for systemic risk have been identified, such as, for instance, these complex interdependencies, but also transboundary effects, nonlinearity with tipping points, and that then in conjunction also leads to sort of a lag in policymaking and risk perception processes where sort of risk, the population or populations, I should rather say, then sort of act upon risk information in a manner that sort of is causally disconnected and also temporarily disconnected from a specific risk event. This is why then also going back, thank you, sort of the governance approaches that we identified need to map to these risk characteristics, especially identified for systemic risk. First of all, there's the complex interrelationships. And this is why sort of governance in that regard and policymaking should be rooted in interdisciplinary cooperation. So that might not be new to you, but sort of what this also comes with is a modular approach towards modeling frameworks with focus on system thinking, also thinking along the lines of identifying system boundaries and where sort of these also might connect and where sort of the model frameworks in a modular architecture might actually sort of link different pieces of the puzzle together. Another challenge relates to uncertainty about causality, then also probability, and then also potential outcomes of policy interventions. This calls for adaptive and evolutionary governance approaches that are agile and able to pivot depending on how a specific systemic risk might unfold. But connected to all of this is also ambiguity, sort of about the interpretations of outcomes, where sort of, for instance, different sort of data sets can be interpreted differently, sort of although sort of the science might be the same, sort of different outcomes might be associated with the same scientific objectives and same scientific observations. But then there is also the interpretation, the interpretation of potential policy outcomes that is rooted in normative ambiguity. And this touches upon sort of also diverse attitudes towards risk, but also diverse risk implications for policies in societal groups. And this is, this calls for, thank you, this calls for approaches of governance that are rooted and based in inclusiveness and co-creation to identify, together with the affected public and with stakeholders, acceptable policy options. Next slide. And this is for our take based on our literature review of governance approaches. We advocate for a two-pronged approach. One that is concerned with analyzing the systems, first sort of what we called here the system one, the risk emitting systems, and sort of academia and research is traditionally strong on identifying hazards and sort of how they gave rise to specific risks. And that is also often accompanied by an institutional analysis that looks into regulation and frameworks, policy frameworks. But this should also be accompanied by an analysis of societal risk controversies, which kind of give the societal bounds within which both the hazards and risks unfold, but also the institutional arrangements then take hold. Next slide on click, thank you. This gives then rise to our second sort of approach, and these two are sort of mutually complementing each other, which looks into procedures. How can this analysis of what is going on be supported by adequate procedures? And here we propose an iterative process founded in the International Risk Governance Council's work on risk governance, which is an iterative approach where not only communication with stakeholders and the public is key, but that also reflection at critical points about the underlying premises of our governance processes and procedures is sort of already built into the process. And this allows this governance process to pivot as the systemic risks unfold. And also participation with stakeholders, the affected public, and also the interested public is key in that regard. And what is depicted here as a circle, you would actually depict that sort of in real life as a sort of a spiral that continues to go on and to reflect. Next slide, please. So some discussion points where we think that systemic risk and polycrises are actually interlinked concepts that can support, or where scholarship can support each other. First thing is the issue of temporality. Both with systemic risk and polycrises, sort of temporal dynamics are crucial and are key to identify. First, with the root causes of what gives rise to systemic risk and or polycrisis, but also about the dynamics of hazards unfolding, but also the societal dynamics and the dynamics of cascading failure. Another issue where these concepts are linked is with regards to governance. Both here we should focus, or it is our take, Silke Juhola and my take, we should rather focus on positive transformation pathways and sort of built into the governance procedures already a critical reflection on the broader societal implications and also the ethical and normative implications of policies across diverse stakeholder groups. And with that, thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Michael J. Albert, who is a lecturer in global environmental politics at the University of Edinburgh. Michael.
Thanks, Mike. So the title of my contribution is Capitalism, Complexity, and Polycrisis towards Neo-Gramscian Polycrisis Analysis. So I should first just mention that I'm coming from a different perspective. I'm based in Politics and International Relations department, coming from the perspective of kind of critical political economy. And so more social theory perspectives, interested in understanding and critiquing capitalism and its possible futures. Next slide, please. And so coming from this perspective, the key contribution that I make in this paper is an intervention in emerging debates between polycrisis advocates and their Marxist critics. So more the people coming from the left and the Marxist tradition arguing that the concept of polycrisis and many scholars using that framework have basically not given enough attention to the role of capitalism in creating the polycrisis world that we're now living in, as well as constraining collective responses to it, and so that there's been relatively superficial engagement with the problem of capitalism, and so we've seen this kind of Marxist critique become more common in relation to polycrisis discourse. And so in this paper, I broadly agree with this criticism for the most part. I think that polycrisis thinking needs Marxism and other critical political economy perspectives in order to deepen its analysis of the political and economic drivers of polycrisis events. But on the other hand, I also think that these perspectives have a lot to learn from polycrisis thinking. And in particular, I'm interested in what they can learn for the purposes of informing our analysis of possible futures, and in particular, more desirable futures. And so I think, critical political economy perspectives, really progressive movements in general, any of us who are aiming for a better world, we need polycrisis thinking to understand the political opportunities and constraints that intersecting crises may create for counter-hegemonic movements. And by counter-hegemonic, I mean, movements trying to challenge the status quo to create a different world, a different set of power relations, a different set of ideas and values underpinning the world economy. Next slide, please. And so to develop this kind of approach, so I synthesize elements of Marxism and polycrisis thinking. And in particular, I draw from the neo-Gramscian tradition, which is kind of a subset of Marxism, which investigates hegemonic and counter-hegemonic projects through which elite factions, so factions of the capitalist class, through alliances with elements of the working class, seek to maintain or to challenge the rules and norms that underpin the world economy. So when we're talking about a hegemonic structure, we're talking about the dominant power configuration in the world economy, whereas counter-hegemonic projects are trying to create different configurations of ideas and material power oriented around different kinds of values. And so I'm particularly interested in neo-Gramscian approaches that engage with complexity theory and systems thinking. And so the work of Jeremy Gilbert and Alex Williams is something that I draw on. But I've also already begun to bring some of these ideas together in my book, Navigating the Polycrisis, which this article also builds on. So I claim that by bringing together neo-Gramscian analysis with polycrisis thinking, we can more effectively identify desirable futures or equilibria through and beyond the global polycrisis. So what possible futures exist beyond the current global polycrisis, in the sense that they can be thought of as stable, self-reinforcing equilibria or attractors that counter-hegemonic movements can try and push the world system towards. And I argue that in order to do this, so on one hand, we need this kind of polycrisis analysis. We need to understand in detail the way in which these crises intersect and potentially reinforce each other, and in order to deepen our understanding of kind of the policy options that are available, because we need to have that holistic lens. If we don't, then we risk advocating policy responses that may address the climate and energy crisis, but then may reinforce other crises, like biodiversity loss, etc. But then in addition to that, we also, and this is where kind of the neo-Gramscian approach comes in, we need deeper analysis of the political coalitions that would underpin different pathways. And so it's not enough to simply say, here's kind of the ideal policy platform through which we can respond to the polycrisis. The question is, how we need a strategic perspective on how might that get implemented? What would be the political forces that could mobilize behind it, that would support it, and form a broad enough coalition that could enable the implementation of these kinds of alternative, more radical policy options. And so that's why we need this neo-Gramscian perspective. Otherwise, the risk is that we're just kind of giving idealist policy platforms with no grounding in material political reality. And so this is kind of basically how I envision bringing these different perspectives together. I think this is the most important contribution that a critical political economy perspective can make to the polycrisis debates. And so then in this paper, I specifically use this kind of framework to look at counter-hegemonic struggles and possible futures in the European Union. And so rather than trying to tackle the kind of the question of how we shift the planet or the world system as a whole into a more desirable equilibria, I focus on a kind of still very hard but more tractable question of the EU. And so there's 3 key steps that I take in this section. So first, I briefly analyze the EU's own polycrisis. And so I'm not going to go into detail here, but the EU is currently facing its own cocktail of intersecting ecological, geopolitical, economic, social, and legitimacy crises. And so the question is, what's the configuration of crises and what are the constraints and options that it creates in terms of making sense of the EU's possible futures? And so then the second step, so I show how mainstream policy responses embodied in the recent Mario Draghi's report on how the EU can respond to the threat of Russian militarism while increasing its economic competitiveness, while also pursuing decarbonization and trying to rejuvenate economies out of its protracted, prolonged stagnation. I show how these kind of mainstream policy responses supported by the mainstream kind of centrist European political class, why it's almost certainly bound to fail and will lead to deepening polycrisis shocks for the EU and likely a failure of the European project over time. And then the third step is that I analyze 4 alternative scenarios, so 4 more alternative desirable futures in Europe's possibility space. And then I think about, what are the different political coalitions that could underpin each scenario, and also what are the trade-offs between them in terms of, what would be the benefits, but then also why might some of these futures fail to be self-reinforcing or fail to be stable futures. And so I'm not going to go into depth here, but I basically you can think about these futures following this kind of 2x2 axis of uncertainty chart. And so on one side, you can imagine futures that involve deeper EU integration. On the other hand, you could envision futures of EU fragmentation, or basically futures that kind of give up on the project of deeper supranational EU integration. And then on the other side, you can envision more kind of reform projects that are more about kind of regulating capitalism and creating a relatively more egalitarian and sustainable form of capitalism. Or you can have projects that aim for more radical post-capitalist and post-growth transformation, aiming for a radically different kind of economy beyond GDP growth, beyond capitalist power, based more on kind of democratic planning and subordinating markets to collective goals. And so then you have the 4 combinations there, which I talk about in the paper and kind of go through the different trade-offs. And so I'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A if anyone is interested, but I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Michael. We're now going to go to Ashwin Seshadri, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences and the Devecha Center for Climate Change at the Indian Institute of Science. Ashwin.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. I'm Ashwin Seshadri. I will summarize an intelligence briefing in this special issue with Ajay Gambhir and Ramit Debnath. Our perspective is interdisciplinary. As Mike mentioned, I work in climate science and also applications to energy transitions. My co-authors are experts in energy transitions and computational social science applied to climate action, respectively. So the previous speakers have very helpfully defined systemic risks, their shared features, the context in which they appear. Our premise in this article is the following. An important part of mitigating growing systemic risks is mitigating climate changes. And therefore, the polycrisis context impels low-carbon energy transitions. At the same time, systemic risks also threaten these transitions. And given that the breakdown of energy transitions could accelerate environmental change and aggravate polycrises, we ask the following questions. First, what are the key systemic risks, or rather, what are some of the key systemic risks facing these transitions? And second, how can energy transitions mitigate the wider risks? So in the second slide, thank you, there is more context. I will start by noting well-documented gaps in climate change mitigation, both in credibility and ambition. However, hope endures with the COP in 2023 for the first time calling for a fossil fuel phase out. At the same time, while transition pathways are deeply uncertain, normatively speaking, we are on a planetary clock motivated by the imperatives of Earth system dynamics, so to speak. And moreover, any changes to the energy system must occur amidst the background complexity of the wider world and associated polycrisis dynamics, but also very likely growing complexity of the decarbonizing energy system itself on the supply side, as well as on the demand side, as including the effects of density of energy utilization. So we all recognize that the pace of energy systems transformation required is unprecedented. Also, when one looks at past energy revolutions, which themselves are incomplete. So there is a need for a deliberate alignment of energy transitions with polycrisis mitigation, both within the energy system and across interacting systems. So the context of derailment risk is important to our story, and a part of our article parallels the analysis of derailment risk. In addition, we explore broader needs of the alignment and the two-way interactions between energy transitions and polycrisis risk, and all that it entails. So there are various pillars to the response, from public understanding and support to long-termism and multilateralism, multidimensionality, and honest hope, whose importance is only elevated by the confluence of urgency and
it looks like Ashwin has frozen here. That's unfortunate. Unless he comes back very quickly, perhaps we'll move along to our next speaker and hope that we can give Ashwin another chance whenever he comes back in. With apologies for the technical problems here, I think we'll move quickly to Alexandre Guiguier, who is Assistant Professor of Chemistry at the Royal Military College of St. John in Canada. Alexandre.
All right, I think Ashwin is back, but I can move on if you want. No worries. So thank you for having me. I'm here to present a paper that I have co-authored with Bruno Charbonneau, who's a professor of international relations at the Royal Military College of St. Jean as well. And this paper is the fruit of several discussions and attempts from myself and Bruno to explore the interface where science and policy meets. So can you please change slide, Mike? So our contribution, we wish to challenge and hope to expand upon how we understand and navigate what is now called the polycrisis. We ask the question, what if the real issue isn't just the crisis themselves, but the radical uncertainty that they generate and the limit of how we conceptualize and respond to such uncertainty. Next slide, please. So the paper that was calling for contribution from Mike Lawrence, that is hosting this event today, defines the polycrisis as a causal entanglement between multiple global systems with an emphasis on systemic interdependence and identifying intervention points to improve governance outcomes. We come in with a slightly different angle where we propose to reframe the polycrisis not merely as an empirical problem to solve, but as a contested political and epistemic space. In other words, we argue that addressing or navigating the polycrisis can only be done at the intersection of science and policy politic, which we call in the paper the uncertainty possibility space. Next slide, please. So for us, there's three main things. First, the polycrisis is not merely a multiple crisis. It's an entanglement of scientific uncertainty. We can think about tipping points, planetary boundaries, climate model, and political uncertainty. What decision must be made by whom, when? And for us, more importantly, the Anthropocene lies at the heart of the polycrisis. We argue that science and politics are not on separated realms. We argue that the separation of science and politics and the usual linear model of knowledge production are insufficient to address the polycrisis problem. Decision under radical or deep uncertainty, such as the one we face right now, involves co-production of science policy model, at the core of which scientific and political judgment collide, compete, fuse, and mutate the mutual shaping of scientific knowledge and or political judgment. Next slide, please. So what we propose in our paper, and this is really like the beginning of a project that me and Bruno are moving forward, is to use what we call decision-making under deep uncertainty to help us navigate the polycrisis. So the goal here is not to solve the polycrisis, but to support plausible and evidence-based decision in the face of imperfect information, deep uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The MDU methods offer structured approach to explore deeply divergent future and evaluate the robustness of strategy without relying on precise prediction or probability. We wish to leverage AI assist the MDU to create multiverse of plausible future where policymaker can test strategy under shifting assumption and worldwide views. And to give you an example of this, we wish, and we are using climate emulator to generate several different future under several different SSP pathways. And we hope that this will help decision maker to address these issues face on. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, for us, the polycrisis is not merely a tangle of causal chains. It's a condition of radical indeterminacy and a site of contested political possibility. We think that our proposal to inhabit and manage the uncertainty possibility space helps expose the assumption behind policy claims, foster collaboration between scientists and decision maker, and keep open the possibility of new future. Not just better management of the present, but really open the possibility of new future. And I would conclude on saying that rather than aiming to reduce the uncertainty, we must learn to live with it and recognize the opportunity that it carries as well. So thank you. I'll be happy to answer more questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Ashwin, if you're able to resume, I believe we were on this slide. Perhaps you could just, jump right back into your presentation before the last one.
Yes. My apologies for the interruption. We had a power failure. So this slide map that shows potential interactions. The plus sign indicates that an increase in the node at the tail of the arrow increases the node at the head. So a decrease in the tail also causes a decrease at the head. In contrast, minus indicates opposite signs of change at tail and head. So for example, energy infrastructure damage can diminish energy transitions and feedback through effects of global warming and extreme weather. Another feedback loop goes through the labor market disruptions, through inequality to societal backlash, which can amplify political resistance to energy transition policies. Yet another loop goes through mining to ecosystem health, to crop damage, to the extent of the energy transition itself. And there are links through environmental change, migration, geopolitics, as well as domestic political choice, and the supply side of the energy transition. And there will, of course, be knock-on effects owing to climate change if this were to occur. These are, in fact, meant to evoke causal effects, but we recognize, as we learned earlier today, that there's uncertainty about causality when it comes to systemic risk. And the map as it stands is a qualitative description of what are some important links, potentially. And in this sense is a first step. And of course, there's more work needed to understand the strengths of the various links, their completeness, the underlying complexity of the nodes themselves, and so on. And of course, understanding effects of various feedbacks, their interactions, as well as higher order effects that can emerge. So in conclusion, in the next slide, there are various risks to energy transitions, broadly speaking, from factors external to low carbon energy policy, from feedbacks from within climate policy itself, and through effects of climate change on resource economies. And these all interact in various ways, and disregarding these risks can have wider impacts beyond energy transitions. In that direction, transition policies can impinge on the capacity for public goods provision in general, as well as on energy and finance sectors in particular, to name a few. And for this reason and others, energy transitions require navigating polycrisis dynamics skillfully. And amidst this urgency of the needed transitions, it's important to be asking and attending to the question of what can be the irreversible changes in the enabling conditions that we must watch out for, and while also being attentive to new risks and how to manage them. All of this is made harder by the fact that we seem to be we are on a clock for energy transitions to be effective. But developing this area further at the intersection of energy transitions and systemic risk can perhaps feed into the wider inquiry of tools, methods, strategies to address the polycrisis. Thank you, and I would be happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Ashwin. We're now going to turn to Rachel Ainsworth, who is a researcher at SESHAT, the Global History Databank, and also research director of the Social or Societal Dynamics, or SODI, Policy Lab. Rachel, please take it away.
Hello, my name is Dr. Rachel Ainsworth. As Mike said, I am a co-author of The Revolution in the Age of Polycrisis, which I co-wrote with my colleague, Dr. Daniel Hoyer. So our work really tried to analyze historical revolutions and extend our understanding of this phenomena at multiple scales to analyze how they arise, so revolutionary situations, their trajectories, how they unfold, and what are the revolutionary outcomes. So what occurs in the aftermath of revolution? And one of the things that we noticed from the onset was how domestic and international factors really filtered in and played on each other. And this can cause revolutionary situations to emerge. And revolutionary theorist George Lawson, with whom our work engages with, notes that global networks are really intermeshed and they can produce multiple and complex stressors and triggers that cause revolution. And he talks about this in a way of an intersocial approach, which builds on this understanding of the generative role of transboundary entanglements, which is in relation to people, networks, and states that really drive revolutionary dynamics. So like our understanding of revolution, the polycrisis concept critically links different types of systems, noting how interactions between economic, environment, and sociopolitical systems may impact each other in complex ways, creating complex feedback loops. And we thought this could be actually a really useful framework in understanding how revolutionary situations develop and unfold over time. So in our article, we argue that revolutions, in our view, is best understood as outcomes or manifestations of multiple crises and or polycrisis. And at the same time, the outcomes and events that occur within and after revolutionary moments can also potentially contribute to further stresses that comprise of a polycrisis situation. So in order to discuss these mechanisms, we investigated for one of our case studies, the Arab Spring. The other case study was the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. So in the origins of the Arab Spring, it was diverse amongst different countries, but there were certain patterns that emerged. A lot were raging against crony capitalism, growing gaps in wealth inequality, high food prices, and repressive regimes. Likewise, we can witness that these stressors were exacerbated by the polycrisis of the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis, which really acted as major pressure points. And compounding the global economic downturn, another feature was the anthropogenic climate change. And this put strain on further vulnerable national systems. There was also speculation in food and energy, poor agricultural policies, and growing youth dissatisfied in the lack of social mobility. And these all converged to create fertile ground for mass grievances resulting in the Arab Spring. So we argue in our paper that the polycrisis concept can reveal important features about revolutionary dynamics that is missed sometimes in traditional approaches. And to further this, Michael Lawrence and the Cascade Institute conceptualized that there are 5 critical interconnected properties that enable polycrisis to emerge. And these 5 properties can also be fruitfully applied, we argue, to the dynamics of revolution. So firstly, the Arab Spring was never linked to one single crisis or primary cause, but in fact were driven by multiple causes, shifting between temporal and spatial bounds. Secondly, there was nonlinearity and feedback loops. This was witnessed in the rise of food prices due to speculation in food and energy after the financial crisis. For countries like Egypt, who privatized industries and depended on food imports, this created higher prices for their population. And to make matters worse, drought in wheat exporting countries like Russia, China, and Ukraine further added costs to the food. So as each force grew, this spurred on dysfunction in other areas. Next, we have hysteresis, in which systems can sometimes move out of equilibrium and become non-reversible. In the case of Syria, decades of poor water management was exacerbated by a 3-year drought. This caused 1.5 million people to be internally displaced. This caused various vulnerabilities in urban areas due to lack of housing, job market. This causes mass grievances, and which eventually lead to trigger events such as the brutal arrest and torture of teenage boys who were graffitiing slogans against Bashar al-Assad. This caused massive protests in Syria, leading to the Arab Spring, and you enter a point of no return. Revolutionary situations also exhibit boundary permeability. Stressors in one area can weaken the resilience in other systems. This is exemplified in domino effects, where you see the Arab Spring protest travel from Tunisia all the way to Bahrain. And lastly, we have, like Black Swan events, revolutions have historically been rare and hard to predict. Black Swan events can also produce extreme outcomes and further crisis, causing deep uncertainty. And the Arab Spring has unwittingly facilitated crisis through proxy wars in Syria and Yemen, and power vacuums that have created the rise of ISIS and its affiliates to thrive. And further, these conflicts have contributed to mass migration of people in Europe, where far-right groups like the AfD in Germany have produced anti-migration narratives, having really major consequences on European democracy. So this is a bit about our article and how we view revolution and polycrisis theory really merging. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, to provide some comments on these papers, we're very fortunate to have Johan Rockström, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and Professor of Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you for these great papers. I mean, congratulations. I think this is exactly, Mike, what we were hoping for. I know that Ortwin is on the call as well, and I think that if Tad Homer-Dixon would have been with us, I think this is when the idea came up of trying to stimulate an interdisciplinary scientific endeavor on defining the polycrisis, on digging deeper into different facets of a current or emerging policy crisis. This is essentially what we were hoping for. And I agree with you, Mike, that this also, in my view, confirms that the polycrisis is much more than a buzzword. It really is an emerging, interdisciplinary, really critical scientific field of inquiry necessary for us to be able to navigate the Anthropocene. So I think that just to put that as a starting point. Secondly, my and you know this Mike, I mean, my own definition of the boundary conditions for a polycrisis may perhaps be even, let's say, setting an even higher set of necessary criteria to be met to really be a polycrisis. So just let me walk those through very briefly, and I think it was very nicely summarized by you, Rachel, in the final presentation here, which I very much agree with. I mean, number one being that this is an Anthropocene feature, meaning that we're talking about social ecological interactions across scales, but that accumulate up to the global level. In my view, that is today one criteria entry point for a polycrisis. The second is systemic risk. Yes, that this has to be a chain of interactions that reinforce and cause cascades of impact. So the points about nonlinearity and hysteresis are fundamental. And I think that is what, in my view, is the absolute core criteria, which is that a polycrisis occurs when multiple crises occurs simultaneously and cause interactions and feedbacks that reinforce each other, so that you get a self-amplifying impact which goes beyond what you would have expected. And I think the example of the Arab Spring is a good one. I think another very basic one today is how climate change and biodiversity loss leads to food insecurity and higher frequency and amplitude of extreme events, which destabilizes societies, causing displacement, migration, and conflict, and how migration drives populism and misinformation, which impacts on backtracking on policy, which reinforces climate change. And you have a cycle that reinforces itself in a self-amplifying, complex, much, much broader, let's say, cocktail than you normally explore, even when you focus on climate risks or biodiversity risk, and can conclude scientifically that we are facing existential risks in these different domains. But if you look at the dynamics across the socio-ecological space in the Anthropocene, you end up in a polycrisis mode of inquiry. Are we therefore in a polycrisis today? I think, and that was quite honestly put out when we invited to this special issue, and I would argue personally that I think the jury is still out. And I think it has, no, I know it has, of course, essentially to do with how we define polycrisis. But if you define it at this, let's say, highest level of criteria to be met, then you could argue that that at the global level, there may in the end just be one polycrisis, and that is when all these geopolitical, social, economic, and Earth system risks interact into one perfect storm at the global level, which would suggest that humanity can in fact only face the polycrisis once, and either we solve it or we go under. And of course, that's a very dramatic way of portraying the polycrisis, but I just put that out as a bit of a challenge for us, which means that I think we are actually exploring different facets of crisis in the Anthropocene, and that they have different dimensions. You might have like small polycrisis and big polycrisis, and ultimately there may be just one, pinnacle polycrisis, and that is the one we ultimately must avoid to avoid the extinction of the world and human development as we know it. So anyway, this is just to say how inspiring it has been to read your papers and to receive these brilliant summaries you've given. And I think Mike and Alison, I think this inspires us to continue. And I'm not sure how the future looks for global sustainability in this context, but I think it's a really great contribution to the broader scientific community, but also beyond that to the whole sustainability, finance, economics, policy areas out there. So a very nice start. Thanks. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Johan. We have about 11 minutes left and a few questions here. So I'm going to raise one broad general question for everybody, and then a few additional questions, and just let people respond in the order of the presentations. The sort of overarching question here is how the word crisis and the framing of crisis can be seen as describing a more transient phenomenon. We have a crisis that ends and then returns back to normal or back to past equilibria. But a lot of what we're talking about in this context is not necessarily a crisis in that sort of regard. It's rather something more like a change of state that's mostly irreversible. So I think here the question is, how do you as authors think about this as in terms of the language of crisis, whether this crisis has a transient phase or whether we are sort of in an era of what some have called permacrisis, of a whole new world. In addition to that question, I think, Pia, you might be able to elaborate a little bit on how the concept of systemic risk addresses this kind of issue of temporality. There's also a question here for Michael Albert as to the post-growth and post-capitalism scenario that you raised implies a steady state economy, which has been on the agenda for a long time, but the question is really what sort of coalition could actually move that sort of agenda forward. And I have a question here for Ashwin. Just how did you select the variables in your causal loop diagram? And what other variables might you add? And so I will let our speakers pick up on any themes that they want to, starting with Pia and moving through in the order. And if there are any additional questions, I will also try to raise those. So first to Pia.
Thank you so much also for the summary and for all the excellent questions. So I'd like to respond to this question of crises or risk. What would be more appropriate to describe the current status quo of things, and link that to Otwin Ren's question that he put in the chat, how to better deal with polycrisis on a management level. This is also, of course, due to my disciplinary training as a sociologist, so I'm interested in decision making. And this differentiation between risk and crisis is quite important, because when you have a crisis, there is very little time to plan in advance, right? You need to have your fallback plans already sitting in the drawer, and you have your established protocols, and this is what you follow through with. Whereas with the risk and risk as a guiding concept, there is the potentiality that something might unfold, and there might also be benefits, right? But this is in the future. Whereas with crises, it is happening here and now. And for a management perspective, having this kind of like this wiggle space to adapt and to pivot is crucial. So I think that these are, from this angle, from this management decision-making angle, these polycrisis and systemic risk, they are actually quite different in their implications.
Great, thank you. Let's move to Michael Albert, please.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for the question, and also thank you for your great work on the growth paradigm in international relations. So it's a really good question, and so to kind of give the gist of kind of how I would respond to that. So coming from a neo-Gramscian perspective, especially building on Jeremy Gilbert and Alex Williams' work, the question always, in terms of trying to determine, whether there's a plausible kind of social base or counter-hegemonic coalition that could cohere around something like a post-growth project. The question is, if we can determine, which constituencies, both, in terms of elite factions or, factions within the population at large or the working class, who has at least a potential material interest in that program, in that possible political project. So that's kind of the analytic challenge. But then there's the practical challenge in terms of, even if there is a potential interest, how do you actually, through organizing and narrative building, articulate those interests together into an actual material force? And so that's a question for political organizing and strategy, which is beyond the scope of the paper. But identifying the potential constituencies who have at least a potential material interest in post-growth transitions is what I try to think about. And I think we need to go beyond the abstraction, the claim that everyone has a material interest in a habitable planet, right? So everyone should be interested in post-growth transition. Of course that's true on some abstract level, but as we've seen concretely politically, these kind of universal appeals to protecting the planet don't do much to motivate people politically compared to more bread and butter economic quality of life issues. So this coalition needs to be articulated more at the level of kind of economic interest in quality of life, economic security, these kinds of things. And so in the paper I talk about how you have the relatively high educated professional managerial middle class, which is kind of the main social base for post-growth, degrowth type projects. And so the question, how do you expand beyond that, highly educated, already climate conscious, sustainability oriented, professional middle class constituency? And so, I mean, broadening appeal to the working class. I mean, on one hand, you have the care sectors of the economy. So, education, healthcare workers, who are often some of the most radical segments of the working class, who do have an inherent material interest in these kinds of post-growth projects that involve, focusing on well-paid care work, because this would be a major, feature of a post-growth economy, more emphasis on care labor. But then in terms of how to appeal to industrial working class, I think that's more of a challenge. But if it involves policy programs like universal basic income, shortening the work week to a 4-day work week, other kinds of reforms that improve quality of life, that improve economic security, these are ways to appeal to kind of the material interest in people's everyday living concerns that I think can get a lot of people behind this kind of project. Because I think most people don't really care about GDP in the abstract. I think most people get that it's a pretty shitty way to measure, quality of life and well-being and progress and all those kind of things. But then the question is, how do you create those things that actually improve quality of life, improve economic security, create stable jobs, in the absence of GDP growth? And that's why, and so creating the narrative that, and the policy platform to show that that's possible and being able to persuade enough people, that's the challenge there. But I do think it's possible to build that coalition. I think the potential material interests exist. I mean, it's just, the question is organizing strategy, knitting them together, building the narrative that resonates with people.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Ashwin now.
Yes. So the question from Ortwin Wen is, how did you select the variables in your diagram on causal connections to influence energy transitions? I could imagine quite a few other variables. So indeed, our diagram is illustrative, but not comprehensive. And as my colleague Ajay Gambhir pointed out in the comments, it's meant to incorporate broad considerations and evoke some of the main issues examined in the literature. There's a lot we've left out. So for example, changes to the cost of capital, associated risk premia, various impacts on learning rates, the nature of the international political economy, to name a few. And also backlash and resistance, or its indirect manifestation through political choice, can have a large exogenous component, as we're learning, and a possibility that perhaps could be considered explicitly. I think it's also clear that challenges impinging on energy transitions and public goods provision are broader, including to more pedestrian factors like political cynicism and zero-sum thinking. It's also evident that psychological factors are important drivers of resistance and backlash in voter choice. So we must face the question not only of the acceptance of large transition efforts in the context of trade-offs amidst wider just transition policies, but also what will the best aspirations look like 20 years from now? So, I think that's a long answer, but the short answer is, to what variables we would include is we don't fully know. We do need systematic elicitation exercises combined with modeling and testing and forward thinking and sound empirical work and all of that. So yes, there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. We'll turn to Alexandra if you have any last thoughts or responses you want to share.
Yeah, I would like to address two things. First, the crisis. From our perspective, we used to think that human history and geological time as unfolding on completely different scale, one fast and the other one very slow, but the Anthropocene changed that. And by turning the human activity into a force that shaped the planet itself, it collapsed the distance between two. So the crisis is no longer just a temporary disruption. It becomes an ongoing condition where human and Earth system are deeply entangled and amplifying each other instability. So this is one thing. And to answer the question from the chat from Ortwin, we believe that DMDU might be a good approach to change the way we're managing or making decisions. It's not just a technical fix, but it's a change of paradigm on how we make decisions. Rather than the usual predict and act model, we accept deep uncertainty, and the uncertainty helps us explore a wide range of plausible future. So this is really a change of the way people are making decisions. We're still in a paradigm of predict and act right now, in our opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Rachel, any closing thoughts?
Well, I appreciate all of the other panelists' comments on their interpretation of crisis and how it relates to the polycrisis. With regard to revolutions, one of the interesting things about revolutions is that sometimes you think that there might be a converging of crisis that would cause a revolutionary situation, but actually those don't materialize. And it's very interesting to see if certain governments make reforms in just the right time, or there's alleviation of societal tensions that can change the course of a revolutionary moment. So that's one thing that I find really interesting. Also, temporality of crisis. How long do crises last? When we look at revolutions, how long do they last? And that's something that Dan and I are actually trying to explore more, is the temporality of revolutions. So yeah, I really appreciate all of your thoughts. They're really thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to take this chance to thank everyone who's in attendance, all of our presenters, and especially Global Sustainability Journal, and especially Natalie and Allison for putting this webinar together. And I will turn it back over to Allison to wrap us up.
Great, thanks, Mike. So yeah, just to close up, I hope this session and Q&A section has covered a broad range of questions and answered anything you might have had. I'd also really like to thank our panelists, Johan, our discussant, and Mike, our chair, for their time and taking part, and to thank everyone very much who has been able to attend today. So thank you very much for joining us.